Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor for History and Systems of Psychology, and we are almost there. We are almost 2/3 finished with our work, and hopefully you have been revising what we have been talking about in these lectures in the past. We covered 33 lectures from materials that ranged from certain philosophers prior to the birth of Christ, and we brought it up until the 20th century. In the last 2 or 3 lectures, we had been talking about a very prominent name in the realm of psychology who was a European by the name of Sigmund Freud, who was born in the late 18th and 19th century and died middle or the first 3-4 decades of the 20th century. یہ پیریڈ جو ہے یورپ میں سائیکالوجی کی ڈیولپمنٹ کے لیے ارتقاء کے لیے بہت ہی پرومیننٹ وقفہ ہے، بہت ہی پرومیننٹ وقت ہے. فرائڈ کے ریفرنس سے ہم نے بات جب شروع کی تھی تو ہم نے اس کے 2 اور بڑے ماہرین نفسیات جو اس کے کنٹمپرری ہم اثر تھے ان کا بھی ذکر کیا تھا، اور ان میں ایک کارل گسٹاو یونگ کا ذکر کیا تھا، اور دوسرا ہم نے ایک اور پرومیننٹ ماہر نفسیات کا ذکر کیا تھا جو کہ پچھلا لیکچر تھا ہمارا. آپ ذرا بتائیے ہم نے کیا بات کی تھی؟ کچھ یاد ہے آپ کو؟ ہم نے دہرایا تھا، ہم نے پڑھا تھا فرائڈ کے ایک اور ہم اثر ماہر نفسیات کو جس کا نام تھا آلفریڈ آڈلر. ہم نے، جیسا کہ آپ اپنی اسکرین پہ بھی دیکھ رہے ہوں گے، آڈلر کے ریفرنس میں ذکر کیا تھا اس کی تھیوری اور اس کی تھراپی کے میتھڈالوجی کا. وی ہیڈ ٹاکڈ اباؤٹ آڈلریان theory of personality, and we had also talked about Adlerian method of psychotherapy. Let us review these 2 quickly, and then from there move on to the North American continent, from Europe back to America. All right? First, Adler's review. If you remember, he talked about feelings of inferiority. He had put forward the view that all of us feel a feeling, have a kind of a feeling of having a basic defect in our personalities, in ourselves. And that basic defect gives rise to what he called feelings of inferiority. The feelings of inferiority in Adlerian theory gives rise to a desire to compensate those feelings, and therefore in a person a striving for superiority takes place. A person, in order to overcome his feelings of inferiority, compensates and develops a feeling of or a striving for superiority. Compensation means doing something to get rid of, to compensate, to disregard what one feels to be lacking in oneself. He also distinguishes between, if you remember, feelings of inferiority and inferiority complex. A feeling in Adlerian point of view is conscious. A feeling of inferiority is a part of one's personality that one is aware of. But then there is the inferiority complex. Inferiority complex is when feelings become, when you repress. जब आप उन feelings को दबा दें, उनसे आप मुंह मोड़ लें, आप उन पे बिलीव ना करें, आप ये समझें कि ये मुझ में कमतरी नहीं है, तो फिर वो फीलिंग जो है आडलर के ख्याल में वो कॉम्प्लेक्स बन जाती है and it goes into the unconscious of a person. So he distinguishes between feelings of inferiority and inferiority complex. Feelings of inferiority are conscious, inferiority complex is unconscious. Inferiority complex gives rise to a drive for aggression. One is propelled from within to be aggressive with others, in one's social group, in one's social environment, and in one's society in general. So, feelings of inferiority leading to an inferiority complex, first turning into striving for superiority and then changing into a drive for aggression. But then Adler points out that we also have what he calls social interest. We are all gregarious. We all want to affiliate. We all want to be in the company of others. ये भी एक universal truth ही है. इसलिए Adler's point of view is that we have what he calls social interest. Social interest is our wish and desire to be with other people. So, on the one hand, people in Adlerian theory have this inferiority complex and feeling, giving rise to a drive for aggression, and on the other hand, they have this social interest. A drive for aggression is almost anti-social, and social interest is almost pro-social. So these are the two opposing poles of personality. Because of these two opposing poles, Adler puts forward the view, a style of life develops. One balances one's energies into pursuing this drive for aggression and also fulfilling this social interest. These two driving forces create a style of life. And style of life, conversely, is an expression of a person's aggression, inferiority complex, the so-called negativity, and an expression of social interest, the need for affiliation, the desire to be with other people. In other words, the positivity of a person. These two different poles create, in Adlerian point of view, a style of life. And style of life is expressed in everything, including in one's mental disease. एक शख्स का जो ज़हनी आर्ज़ा है, वो उसके स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ की अक्कासी कर रहा है आडलर के ख्याल में. और उसको अगर आप समझें मालिज की हैसियत से, तो और उसके अगर आप लाइफ स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ को समझें, तो आपको उसके ज़हनी आर्ज़े की वजूहात भी समझ आ जाएंगी. और इसी बेसिस पे, यही है उसकी बेसिस थियरी का, इसी बेसिस पे आडलर treats his patients adopting certain methodologies. Number one, recognizing that people have a style of life and that people express that style of life in their neurosis also. His methodology consisted of dialogue, identification of inferiority feelings / complex, identification of striving for superiority / feelings of aggression, and identification of social interest. ये इन तमाम चीज़ों की निशानदही जो है वो मालिज करता है मरीज के लिए, और यही बातें मरीज के लिए मशले राह की हैसियत इख्तियार करती हैं और वो इनसे सीखता है. तो एडलर के यहाँ मालिज का किरदार यही है कि वो जो मरीज के स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ है, जो उसकी सोशल इंटरेस्ट और इंफीरियरिटी कॉम्प्लेक्स और फीलिंग्स का इजहार है, उसकी निशानदही करे, मरीज को वो दिखाए, और मरीज उसको देखने के बाद, उसको जज करने के बाद उस पे काबू पाने के काबिल हो जाता है. एंड दैट इज हाउ एडलर ट्रीट्स और प्रोक्लेम्ड दैट people should treat mental diseases. एक बात जो काबिल जिक्र है इसमें एडलर की सिस्टम में, जो आपको याद होगी, वो ये है कि उसने कहा था कि एक शख्स अपने स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ को अपनी रोज़मर्रा की हरकत और सकनात में भी इजहार करता है. उसका बैठना, उसका खड़े होना, उसका कपड़ों का सिलेक्शन, कपड़े पहनना, तरह तरह की अंदाज इख्तियार करना, तेज़ या आहिस्ता बोलना, किस किस्म के चश्मे पसंद करता है, किस किस्म के जूते और पर्स एक खातून पसंद करती है और इस्तेमाल करती है. एडलर के ख्याल में इन तमाम बातों से एक शख्स के न्यूरोसिस का, उसकी ज़हनी आर्जे का या उसकी स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ का इजहार होता है. और मैं समझता हूँ, कुछ माहिरीन नफ्सियात ये भी कहते हैं, मैं उनके साथ एग्री करता हूँ, कि एडलर जो है वो इस लिहाज से पहला साइकोलॉजिस्ट वो है हु हैड आइडेंटिफाइड non-verbal language as a way of communicating, that we also communicate, human beings also communicate, not only by words, but also by deeds. And that is another prominent, important contribution of Adler's. That is what we had talked about related to Adler in the last lecture. Let us go forward. And let us take a look at the North American continent and see what stir had been created there by Freud's writings and his methodology, by Jung's writing and his methodology, and by Adlerian writings and his methodology. In fact, what was the impact of psychoanalysis and their related schools or their related systems on the thinking and development of methodologies on the American continent related to mental disease. The first prominent psychologist that we need to review in this context is, as you can see behind me, Harry Stack Sullivan. He got his doctorate and he taught and practiced in America, Washington, D.C. He trained as a psychiatrist, and I hope you know the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. Let me just touch on that in the next 1 or 2 minutes, क्योंकि इसमें मैं समझता हूँ इन टर्म्स के मुतल्लिक हमारे अक्सर लोगों में बहुत सा कन्फ्यूजन अभाम पाया जाता है. इसलिए इस बात को अगर आज इस वक्त यहाँ टच कर लें तो अच्छा रहेगा. पहली तो बात यह है कि साइकियाट्रिस्ट जो लफ्ज़ है वो अमेरिका में और यूरोप में और मुख्तलिफ मानी में इस्तेमाल होता है. पहली तो एक बात ये जहन में रखिए. फ़िलहाल हम यूरोपियन अंदाज में इसको समझते हैं कि लफ्ज़ का क्या मतलब है, क्योंकि हम भी, हमारा निज़ाम तालीम भी यूरोपियन सिस्टम से मुतल्लिक रहा है, इसलिए हमारे यहाँ भी वही सिस्टम और वही टर्मिनोलॉजी है जो यूरोप में राइज थी, इसलिए हम भी यूरोप को फॉलो करते हैं फॉर द टाइम बीइंग अंटिल वी ब्रेक ऑफ. यूरोप में साइकियाट्रिस्ट इज अ पर्सन हु इज ए मेडिकल डॉक्टर. हमारे यहाँ भी ऐसा ही है. साइकियाट्रिस्ट इज अ पर्सन हु इज ए मेडिकल डॉक्टर, जिन्होंने तिब में डिग्री हासिल की हो, MBBS या इससे बुलंद बाला डिग्री, MD या फॉरेन क्वालिफिकेशन, और उसके बाद उन्होंने स्पेशलाइज किया हो इन द ट्रीटमेंट ऑफ मेंटल डिसऑर्डर्स. सो ए साइकियाट्रिस्ट इन द यूरोपियन पाकिस्तानी सेंस इज समबॉडी who is a medical doctor who treats mental patients, mental diseases by medical means. A psychotherapist in the European and Pakistani sense is somebody who's been trained in psychotherapy who's not a medical doctor. He has to have a certification or a license or training in treatment of mental disorders. He is a psychotherapist. A psychiatrist is a doctor. A psychotherapist is a specialist in treatment of mental diseases, but with using other than medical means. ये तो हमारे यहाँ एक देखने वाली बात है. इसी बात को अगर हम अमेरिका में देखें तो वहाँ थोड़ा सा फर्क है. A psychiatrist in the American scene today is somebody who treats mental disorders with or without medicines. He might be a doctor, a medical doctor. He might not be a medical doctor. And that is what we know about the American scene. Coming back to Harry Stack Sullivan, Sullivan was a psychiatrist, a physician by nature, by profession, who later on changed to treatment of mental disorders and then developed his own theories such that he even abandoned use of medicine in treatment of mental disorders. But we'll talk about that later. For the time being, keep it in mind that he was a psychiatrist who worked at Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. also, let me explain it to you. D.C. हम इसलिए लगाते हैं कि वो एक छोटा सा इलाका है जहां पर अमेरिका की एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन सारी वहां बैठते हैं. और D.C. stands for District of Columbia. It is actually a part of वर्जीनिया एंड मैरीलैंड, दीज टू स्टेट्स, लेकिन उसका कुछ हिस्सा जो है वो वर्जीनिया में है, कुछ हिस्सा जो है वो मैरीलैंड में है, एंड दैट इज डिमार्केटेड एंड दैट्स कॉल्ड डिस्ट्रिक्ट ऑफ कोलंबिया. छोटा सा हिस्सा है. दैट इज वेयर सलीवन practiced his psychiatry. Sullivan was impressed with Freudian point of view. He thought that Freud had a point in so far as Freud showed the influence of unconscious desires, needs, wishes, and motivations on the determination of a person's behavior. Sullivan was also impressed with another social scientist, Ruth Benedict, who was an anthropologist. Anthropology क्या है? इल्मुल इंसान. अगर हम उसका उर्दू तर्जुमा करें तो माहिरीन ने एंथ्रोपोलॉजी का उर्दू तर्जुमा इल्मुल इंसान कहा है, दैट इट इज ए साइंस ऑफ मैनकाइंड. सलीवन read Freud as well as Ruth Benedict, so his theories and his books and his point of view reflect these two influences. That is, there are the unconscious motivations that propel somebody, and in addition, anthropologists say there are the cultural, sociological, larger factors involved in the determination of the psyche, and particularly in determination of mental diseases. Sullivan's point of view then reflects these two points of view, the Freudian and the anthropological. One of the important contributions of Sullivan was that he enumerated, explained the relationship of a baby and a mother. And he put forward the view that the relationship between the infant, द नौमौलूद और उसकी माँ का जो आपस में बाहम ताल्लुक है, वही उस शख्स की और हर शख्स की बाद की जिंदगी में अहम हैसियत इख्तियार कर जाता है. Alright, let us go a little bit deeper and see how Sullivan explains that. He says that the infant feels euphoria. Euphoria means a state of bliss, a state of extreme happiness, extreme satisfaction when his mother is with him or with her. She feeds him, she bathes him, she is a nourisher, she is a protector, she puts him to sleep, she cleans him when he's dirty. And in fact, the baby doesn't have to do anything, the infant doesn't have to do anything, the mother takes care of him or her. And that, Sullivan says, is a feeling of euphoria, what he calls euphoria, extreme satisfaction and happiness. And the baby, when he grows up, wants to have that euphoria reinstated in his life. In Sullivan's point of view, the person is looking for the euphoria, that state of bliss that he enjoyed when he was an infant with his mother. एक तो ये डायनामिक है, एक तो ये मुहर्रिक है सलीवन की थियरी में, हमारी नफ्सियात में या बच्चों की या बड़ों की नफ्सियात में, लुकिंग फॉर ए स्टेट ऑफ यूफोरिया. दूसरी बात जो है जो सलीवन कह रहा है अपनी थियरी में, वो ये भी है कि माँ जो है वो सिर्फ सेटिस्फैक्शन ही नहीं, बल्कि द मदर ऑल्सो कन्वेज ए फीलिंग ऑफ इनसिक्योरिटी इन द चाइल्ड if she herself is tense. और आप जानते हैं कि हकीकत में हर माँ जो है वो कभी ना कभी टेंस तो जरूर होगी. So that tension in Sullivan's point of view is conveyed to the infant, to the baby also. So the baby develops, the psyche develops as a function of this interpersonal relationship between the mother and the infant, depending upon the euphoria and depending upon the insecurity that the child feels. तो दूसरी डायनामिक जो है, दूसरा मुहर्रक जो है सलीवन के ख्याल में, वो है the insecurity conveyed to the child by the mother. Because of the interpersonal relationship with the mother and relationships amongst other people, Sullivan says everyone develops his self of concept. A self of concept is what others show a person to be, what he is. You are a good tennis player, you are a girl, you are a boy, you are tall, you are fat, you are short, you are long, you are happy, you are so on and so forth. All of these reflections develop in Sullivan's point of view as a result of interpersonal relationships. And that is how important interpersonal relationships are in Sullivan's point of view. And he says, as a result of interpersonal relationships, 3 types of selves emerge in a person. And what are those 3 types? The 3 types, one is the good me, वो मैं जो कि अच्छा है. एक शख्स की जो अच्छाइयाँ हैं वो दूसरों को पसंद आती हैं और दूसरे उसको अप्रिशिएट करते हैं. And that appreciation results in a creation of image of a person which is to him the good me. And then there is the bad me. शख्स की एक ज़ात की जो नेगेटिव क्वालिटीज़ हैं, एक इंसान की, एक बच्चे की जो नेगेटिव कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स हैं, इजहार हैं उसकी शख्सियत के, अनासर हैं उसकी शख्सियत के, वो भी उसकी ज़ात का हिस्सा हैं और वो भी वो दूसरों से सीखता है. तो दूसरी ज़ात जो है गुड मी के बाद जो बनती है वो है बैड मी. एक शख्स में कुछ अच्छाइयां हैं, दैट इज गुड मी, कुछ बुराइयां हैं, दैट इज बैड मी. एंड द थर्ड पार्ट ऑफ पर्सनैलिटी इन सलीवन्स पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू इज द नॉट मी, जो मैं नहीं हूं. एक बच्ची जो है वो उसमें अच्छाइयां भी हैं और बुराइयां भी हैं, और क्या नहीं है, शी इज नॉट ए बॉय. सो दीज आर द थ्री टाइप्स ऑफ सेल्फ दैट सलीवन टॉक्स अबाउट. आपको याद है फ्रॉइड ने भी कुछ इसी किस्म की बात की थी. ही डिस्कसेस थ्री एस्पेक्ट्स और एक्सप्रेशंस और parts of personality. Can you recall those three parts in Freudian point of view? The id, the ego, and the superego. ये सलीवन भी तीन चीजों का ही तरफ इशारा कर रहा है. तो एक और बात जो है सलीवन में वो ये है, his theory of development of the self depending upon interpersonal relationships and those selves expressing themselves in terms of the good me, the bad me and the not me. थोड़ा सा से और आगे चलते हैं और सलीवन को एक और पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से देखते हैं. सलीवन also talks about types of experience. हमारे जो इंटरपर्सनल रिलेशनशिप्स हैं, जो बाहमी ताल्लुकात हैं लोगों के, एक शख्स के दूसरे लोगों के साथ, वो भी सलीवन के ख्याल में तीन तरह से उनका इजहार होता है. उनके तीन मज़ाहिर हैं. एक्सपीरियंसेस आर ऑफ थ्री काइंड्स इन सलीवन्स पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू. द फर्स्ट इज व्हाट ही कॉल्स द प्रोटोटैक्सिक एक्सपीरियंस. आप स्क्रीन पे देख रहे होंगे PROTOTAXIC. Prototaxic experience is a kind of a confused experience, an experience which is unorganized, blur, not clear, like the experience of an infant or a baby. Some of our interpersonal experiences fall into this category. The second kind of experiences that Sullivan talks about is what he calls the parataxic experiences or parataxic experience. जैसा कि आप स्क्रीन पे देख रहे होंगे, PARATAXIC. Parataxic experience is the experience which is learned through language and signals and symbols. जो बातें एक शख्स सीखता है या एक्सपीरियंस करता है, लेकिन जो सिंबल्स के जरिए, लैंग्वेज के जरिए, आखिर लैंग्वेज भी तो सिंबल ही है, साइंस के जरिए जो सीखता और लर्न करता है, दैट इज व्हाट सलीवन कॉल्स पैराटैक्सिक एक्सपीरियंस. एंड द थर्ड काइंड ऑफ एक्सपीरियंस इज व्हाट सलीवन कॉल्स द सिंटैक्सिक एक्सपीरियंस. जैसा कि आप स्क्रीन पे भी देख रहे होंगे, syntactic is spelled SYNTAXIC. Syntactic experience is a developed experience, an overt experience, an experience where free communication has taken place and communication facilitates that experience. So, Sullivan is talking about different types of experience, three different types of experience to be precise, depending upon interpersonal relationships. एक नोट करने वाली बात जो है यहां पर वो ये है कि सलीवन इंटरपर्सनल रिलेशनशिप्स को बहुत अहमियत दे रहा है, जैसा कि अब आपने देख लिया होगा. और थोड़ा आगे चलते हैं इसकी थियोरी में. Sullivan also talks about stages of development. stages of development of a human being. And he talks about 7 stages of development. And what are those 7 stages of development? The first one is the infancy. From birth to about 1 to 2 years is the first stage of experience or first stage of development. यहाँ पर बच्चे का शऊरी तजुर्बा बहुत ही कम है. यहाँ पर उसमें डिपेंडेंस सर्वाइवल के लिए एडल्ट्स पर, ख़ास तौर पर माँ पर और फिर बाप पर, वो मोहताजी, वो डिपेंडेंस जो है वो टोटल है. He cannot survive without the mother and the father looking after him. That's the first stage. The second stage is what he calls the childhood stage. The childhood stage is from about 2 plus to about 6 or 7 years of age. यहाँ पर बच्चा जो है उसमें किसी हद तक इंडिपेंडेंस है कि वो चलने फिरने के काबिल है, घूमने फिरने के काबिल है, लेकिन अब भी वो डिपेंडेंट है क्योंकि उसको अपने बड़े और छोटे का फर्क जाहिर नहीं है क्लियरली, और दूसरे उसको बुरे और अच्छे का भी क्लियर फर्क मालूम नहीं है. वो डिपेंडेंट है, वो गाइडेंस चाहता है, वो लैंग्वेज डेवलप कर रहा है इस वक्त. और तीसरी स्टेज है व्हाट सलीवन कॉल्स द जुवेनाइल स्टेज. The juvenile stage goes up to about 7 to 8 years, where the baby is now more or less independent. He can move about in the house, he can play in the yard, he can play in the lawn, he can have friends, and he begins different types of interpersonal relationships now. Now friends and associates begin to become his friends, and they enter into his interpersonal relationships. He learns from them. He is now looking forward to being with them. The next stage is what Sullivan calls the pre-adolescence stage, where the child is between, let us say, the age of about 8 to about 12 years, where he is a different person. He is now more interested in games and sports and hobbies, and in group activities. He wants others' company. He wants to be together. He begins to learn to play games in teams and in groups. And then is the stage what Sullivan calls the early adolescence. And the early adolescence is beginning, let us say, about 13 and ending to, let us say, about 18 to 19 years. This is the time where the stresses and storms of puberty take over. अब उसके जिस्म में एक ऐसा है जैसे तूफान बरपा हो रहा है, because lots of physical and physiological and biological changes are taking place in the body. Here he accepts more influence from his teachers and his peers. And then is what he calls the adolescence stage. Beyond 18 years is adolescence. Adolescence is when he is more or less mature, but other factors, other important needs such as sexuality, such as presence of the opposite sex, begin to dominate his social relations. And the 7th stage that Sullivan talks about is what he calls maturity. Maturity is when he has become an adult, when he is interested in career, when he develops professions, when he looks forward to meeting life, when he is into real life, out of peers, friends, teachers, and family relations, and into the real world. So these are the 7 stages of development that Sullivan talks about. एक दो बातें और सलीवन के बारे में before we end up here. Sullivan's main contribution in psychotherapy was his treatment of schizophrenia. Remember, he was a psychiatrist. He was not a psychotherapist. Remember that? Psychiatrists usually, not always, usually treat severe mental disorders through the use of medication. And Sullivan was a psychiatrist more into treatment of schizophrenia, but he also developed an interview as a technique of treatment of schizophrenia. He discovered, he felt that through the use of interview, he could find out the interpersonal relationships of the schizophrenic with his peers, friends, family, and that gave him the clue to the disease of the schizophrenic. So in his point of view, Sullivan's point of view, interview is an important element in psychotherapy, particularly of schizophrenia. And the last thing that he used for treatment was what he called empathy. Empathy is feeling like, different from sympathy. Sympathy is हमदर्दी, किसी पे रहम आना sympathy है, लेकिन किसी की तरह से महसूस करना is empathy. And he says empathy is an important tool in the treatment of mental diseases. That is one important contributor in the stage that was set by Freud, Jung, and Adler in understanding and treatment of mental disorder. Let us take a look at another important contributor who also belonged to the North American continent, and that is the lady by the name of Karen Horney. Karen Horney was born in 1885 and she died in 1952. She trained as a psychoanalyst and worked as a psychoanalyst for a number of years in the United States before she broke up from the orthodox psychoanalysis because she disagreed with Freud on a number of factors. And one of them was that Freud, in her estimate, had put too much emphasis on sexuality or sex drive as a determinant of human behavior and as a determinant of mental disease. So she broke off from the main psychoanalytical point of view and established her own system. And as you can see on your screen, she had formulated the concept of basic anxiety as the main motivator in a person. In Horney's point of view, it is not sexuality, as Freud had said. In her point of view, it is the basic anxiety that propels a person, that makes up the most important element in his personality. And what is basic anxiety and why does it happen? In Karen Horney's point of view, all of us have had the experience of being a child. A child is dependent. A child is helpless. A child, in order to be able to satisfy his needs and desires, in fact, in order for a child to survive, he is dependent upon others. And that dependence, that deep feeling of not being able to survive without other people supporting him, gives rise to what Karen Horney believes is basic anxiety. And basic anxiety is one of the main ingredients of a person's mental disease also. Basic anxiety turns a person into a neurotic also. Why and how? Because basic anxiety has certain reactions in Karen Horney's point of view. And one reaction of basic anxiety is to develop compensation, to develop a reaction to basic anxiety. हर शख्स का कॉमन तजुर्बा है कि वो एक बच्चा था। और हर शख्स का कॉमन तजुर्बा है कि वो एक बच्चा होने की हैसियत से बालिगों का मोहताज था। और यही बच्चों की मोहताजी जो है, या बच्चों का ये सोचना कि वो अपनी सर्वाइवल के लिए दूसरों के मोहताज हैं, ये उनमें बेसिक एंजाइटी पैदा करती है। हॉर्नी के ख्याल में बेसिक एंजाइटी के 3 रिएक्शन हैं, या बेसिक एंजाइटी जो है वो अपने आप का इजहार 3 तरह से करती है। इन हॉर्नीज पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू, बेसिक एंजाइटी expresses itself in 3 different forms. The first is disguised hostility. आपने महसूस किया होगा कि आपके कुछ जानने वाले इर्द गिर्द के लोग खामखा ही गुस्से में रहते हैं, as if they have a chip on their shoulders, and that is an example of disguised hostility. आमतौर पे वो लोग जो दूसरों को तंज व मजाक का निशाना बनाते हैं, in Horney's point of view, they are expressing their disguised hostility. Criticism, satire on others is an expression, in Horney's point of view, of disguised hostility. That is to belittle them. That is to show that they are not as big as they pose themselves to be. And that is what satire or criticism is. And that is, in Horney's point of view, disguised hostility in a person's personality, the reaction or the expression of basic anxiety that he or she feels as a function of being dependent upon others. The second reaction that Karen Horney talks about to basic anxiety is what she calls temper tantrums. बच्चों में आपने देखा होगा टेम्पर टेंट्रम्स। आपने उनकी मर्जी के खिलाफ मामूली बात भी की और उन्होंने वावेला शुरू कर दिया, जमीन पे लेट गए, चीजें तोड़ दी, चीखें मारनी शुरू कर दी, माँ बाप को पुकारना शुरू कर दिया। All of these are examples of what we in English call temper tantrums in children. That, she says, may continue in later life also, and one may become temperamental. One may become so temperamental as to become very sensitive to even mild disagreements and might show exaggerated reactions. And those are examples of temper tantrums, an expression of what Horney has called basic anxiety that becomes a part of every personality as a result of his or her feeling of dependence upon others during childhood. And the third reaction to basic anxiety is what Karen Horney calls withdrawal. गोशा नशीनी इख्तियार कर ले अगर कोई शख्स, इबादत के लिए नहीं, वो तो अच्छी बात है, लेकिन अगर कोई गोशा नशीनी इसलिए इख्तियार कर ले कि वो दूसरों से बचना चाह रहा है, तो दैट वुड बी एन एक्सप्रेशन ऑफ what she calls basic anxiety. And basic anxiety, as you know, as I've repeated already, is present in everybody and is a result of, is a function of, is a dependent variable of our being a child or us being children at some stages in our lives. So Karen Horney explains the dynamics of one's personality in terms of dependence leading to basic anxiety, leading to 3 types of reactions to basic anxiety, and those 3 types of reactions are disguised hostility, temper tantrums, and withdrawal. She calls all these 3 reactions neurotic reactions. ये सेहतमंद रद्द अमाल नहीं हैं बल्कि गैर सेहतमंद रद्द अमाल हैं. They are called neurotic reactions or neurotic trends by Karen Horney. Interesting, isn't she? All right, we will leave it at that and we will continue with Karen Horney in our next lecture. For the time being, let us see what we have talked about today. We talked about the influence of Freud and Freudians, the Europeans, on the American continent. And in that context, we talked about two prominent North American psychologists, psychotherapists, and psychiatrists. The first of these was Harry Stack Sullivan, who was educated and trained in Washington, D.C. and remained in Washington, D.C., who put forward the view that interpersonal relationships, लोगों के बाहमी ताल्लुकात की बिना पर उनकी नफ्सियात तश्कील पाती है. और बाहमी ताल्लुकात कौन से हैं? सबसे अहम बाहमी ताल्लुक है एक बच्चे और उसकी माँ का. एक बच्चा और उसकी माँ जो है, so he put forward the view that the interpersonal relationship between the mother and the infant determines a child's personality, and that interpersonal relationship continues to impact a person throughout his life. The interpersonal relationships lead to or give rise to three types of experiences. You remember proto-taxic experience, para-taxic experience, and syntaxic experience. You've seen that on your screen also. Then Sullivan talked about 7 stages of development. And what were those stages? As you can see on your screen, the infancy, jab wo chota hai bachcha bilkul, the childhood period, when he is between 1 to 2 years, the juvenile era, up to, let us say, about 6 or 8 years of age, from 2 to 3 years, then the pre-adolescence time, then the early adolescence, and then the adolescence, जिसे हम बलूगत कहते हैं, and then maturity, जिसे हम उनफवान शबाब कह देंगे, या बलूगत और उनफवान शबाब के बाद का जो टाइम है, maturity. This is one person that we talked about, and he showed how interpersonal experiences in one way or the other influence a person for the rest of his life, including his mental disease. We talked about another prominent psychoanalyst, Karen Horney, who was trained as a psychoanalyst, but who later on broke off with classical psychoanalysis and developed her own theory, because she thought that Freud had put too much emphasis on sex as a determinant of human behavior. She put forward the view that as a result of our experience, as a result of parental roles, parental influences on us, we develop what she calls basic anxiety. Basic anxiety gets people to develop 3 types of reactions. And what are those 3 types of reactions? Disguised hostility, temper tantrums, and withdrawal. We touched upon the initial theory of Karen Horney. We will dilate upon it, explain it more in the next lecture, and add to other important ingredients of Karen Horney's theory. Until next time, do take a look at what we have talked about. Do go back to your textbooks and do review these all over again. जब तक के लिए खुदा हाफिज, God be with you.